Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. You're with John. John, it's a pleasure to have you on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, my name's John Potash, and I wrote two books and produced several films. And the first book was The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders, which I published in 2007. It was republished in 2021 as just The FBI War on Tupac Shakur and State Repression of Black Leaders. And then I also wrote the book Drugs as Weapons Against Us, about the CIA's war on musicians and activists, which was published in 2015. And both those books were made into films. And my most recent project was my film just came out called Eugenics To Pandemics.
When it comes to, just the controversial, they're kind of controversial subjects in a way as well, too. Like whenever I talk about like the CIA or drugs or MK Ultra or anything like that, people always like either roll their eyes or they say conspiracy. And it's like, for me as just a person, I like to know more about these types of things. I mean, it does kind of make you go like your brain does melt in a sense when you start finding out all this type of stuff. But then you get over it and it kind of comes more interesting. I feel like I'm more aware when I know more about this type of stuff. Was that the same reaction when you made your books and also your films?
Yeah. People basically the CIA came up with that idea of popularizing the word conspiracy and conspiracy theory as implying irrational. They did that around after the Warren Commission came out with its report about the JFK assassination, and people, have shown, and I've seen the CIA documents on that.
1095 360 is the document.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I'm glad you remember that. I think, yeah, it's ridiculous that it's sad that people fall for that and think that, that just because someone talks about people conspiring means that they're talking about irrational stuff. Of course, the CIA's MK Ultra program has been documented, by finding thousands of their documents, approximately 10 to 20,000 of their documents were revealed in the accounting department after the CIA director in the early to mid 1970s, Richard Helms, ordered all of the MK Ultra documents shredded. So the MK Ultra, Project MK Ultra ran from 1953 to at least the mid 1970s, when again they tried to shred all the documents. It's just in 1961, JFK came upon this project and tried to shut it down. But the assistant, and he fired the director of the CIA, and Alan Dulles, and replaced him. But the lower level people under Alan Dulles who were loyal to him kept it running behind his back, behind JFK's back, President Kennedy's back. And they changed when he found it again in 1964. He tried to shut it down a second time, and so they just changed the name of the project to MK Search instead of MK Ultra. But it kept running to at least the mid 1970s, again when Richard Helms, ordered all the documents shredded because this U.S. Senate Church Committee was investigating what they heard about MK Ultra, and so he tried to hide all those documents. And again, the researchers just found them in the accounting department as duplicates, and that's all we have. And the best estimates are people like Martin Lee, who was researching it for many, many years, MK Ultra, to produce his book Acid Dreams. He said, his best estimate was that the documents that people found are about 10% of the total. So they found maybe some 20,000. So the total is probably 200,000 documents. And this came out in meetings, Senate meetings with Ted Kennedy running those meetings. That's been shown. The film talking about these documents has been shown, and et cetera. So it's not conspiracy theory. It's the CIA top officials conspired to do horrible things with drugs, and use them as what the documents say as unconventional warfare. And when we think of unconventional warfare, we think about warfare in foreign lands. But what the documents appear to show, and what all the evidence, best evidence shows, is that they targeted American dissidents, people like Paul Robeson, the great singer activist, black singer activist who could speak 20 languages, who was also a graduated from Columbia University Law School, was a top athlete, top football player, and lacrosse player. He was just an amazing man. And his son said how they dosed his drink in Moscow. Some American expatriates dosed his drink in Moscow, and really dosed him enough times to make him think he was losing his mind. And when this adult son went over to check on him, he got dosed also. And then they convinced the family to get him help in a London mental hospital, where they used about 50 super high dose electric convulsive shock treatment on him, and ruined his mind. And so he didn't want to be remembered that way. So he went into he became a recluse, and just went in and isolated himself until he died in 1976. But this happened to him about 2 or 3 weeks before he was supposed to meet with Che Guevara and Fidel Castro in Cuba, right after the revolution happened. 2 years after the revolution happened in Cuba in 1959. So that's just one example of the many examples of the way MK Ultra, targeted people who dissented from the government. And I show, of course, the evidence that they also targeted musicians.
Why musicians though? Like for me, it was weird because I remember listening to Tom O'Neill's book about the Manson murders and the Bugalosi his trial and everything. And there's a character called Joylon West, Luis Joylon West. So if you just type him up on Google, anybody out there listening, you're going to get a brief description about this man. And one of the things that they describe him as is using LSD for Korean War veterans to make them forget the acts that they did overseas. It was a way of like mind controlling and brainwashing. That's what he's listed on Wikipedia as. But then if you type in, okay, it says he works for the CIA, you type in him on the CIA website, there's no documents found. But what I did find is Jack Ruby's psychiatric records. And at the bottom right of every single page is a signature, Luis Joylon West. And that's what it's so difficult is whenever you talk about this or MK Ultra, people go, that's conspiracy. It's like, well, they destroyed the documents. And then that makes you even sound more nuts. And it's like, well, how about I show you the document where they said destroy this document? Like that's 100% what happened to me. I'm pretty sure we just got transcripts from warehouses is how we really know that MK Ultra even exists. And when you start going into, well, how deep does this go? We know about like Operation Midnight Climax, drugging random people. And I love these types of conversations. I'm sorry. It fascinates me because this idea that like, oh, it has to be a secret project and secrecy. It's like, I want to know about it because once you start finding out that stuff's real, you start questioning more and you start realizing what exactly does the CIA do? Apparently, they're never supposed to activate on domestic land. Well, we know that's a lie, and they've been doing it for a very long time. So when it comes to the influence in musicians, I mean, is there a certain point that you noticed where they kept going with it, or was it like one person, then they saw it was effective? Did they wait a little bit, or did they just keep on going with every musician they could find?
Yeah, no, I mean, of course, every musician they could find is not the case, because they're not that big. But I think they did target a certain amount of influential musicians to try to, because the CIA, they say they want to control our hearts and minds. They can't control us physically because they're not big enough to control 250, 300 million people, whatever the population of the US is, about 280 million people. But so they want to control our hearts and minds. And they also want to have influence overseas too, of course. So, yeah, with musicians, I found evidence with regarding John Lennon, for example. Now, there was a top biographer of, there was a top investigator of John Lennon, who was a lawyer, Fenton Bressler, who wrote the book Who Killed John Lennon, and so he started investigating John Lennon's murder in 1980. He investigated for 7 years. He was a columnist for a top daily British newspaper, along with being a barrister, they call him there, an attorney, a British lawyer. And so he filed freedom of information requests, got lots of FBI documents, 200 or 300 FBI documents. They referred to CIA work and CIA documents, but when he tried to get CIA documents, I believe he only got a few pages total, but a lot of the FBI documents referred to many more pages, and but that's all he could get. And so he showed the evidence that yes, the CIA had trained, uh, you know, Mark Mark David Chapman to basically they work with police for one thing. That's been well documented. That it goes from it's a huge hierarchy. When the CIA was founded in 1947 with the National Security Act of 1947, it made the CIA director the director and supervisor of all other 14 plus intelligence agencies: naval intelligence, army intelligence, FBI, NSA, etc. And and then underneath them, there was police, local police. Now, there's also police intelligence units, and when you analyze all these different operations, such as the operations that I analyzed against the Black Panthers, and you look at the FBI documents regarding them, such as the basically activists broke into an FBI office in 1971 and stole thousands of FBI documents and from a Media, Pennsylvania FBI office, and they spread them to the press, and they compiled them in books, etc. And so the COINTELPRO papers, that book shows by Ward Churchill and Jim Vanderwall and the Agents of Repression both use those documents, and they show how uh, basically former CIA, supposedly former CIA, could become directors of police intelligence, as happened in New York City, under the head of the Bureau of Special Services, which was New York Police Intelligence, was a formerly part of the CIA. Other people, such as FBI agents, would go down and work as also police intelligence. And so they'd have two titles. One is, agent of FBI, and another is agent of New York Police Department. And that was found with a police agent who was caught on the scene of Biggie Smalls' death, the rapper Biggie Smalls. And I mentioned that not because Biggie was a political musician, but Tupac was a very political musician. His family were all leading Black Panthers. He was a one-time leader of the New African Panthers, which was active in 8 cities around the country, and was working with the adult, activists of the New African Peoples Organization, who were former Black Panthers. And so the FBI documents that were stolen in 1971 show this massive targeting of the Black Panthers nationwide, and targeting of leftists in general around the country, starting in the 1950s. And it showed that about anywhere between 97 and 99% of the activities of the FBI were targeting leftist activists, anti-war activists, civil rights activists, particularly brutally targeting the Black Panthers, targeting American Indian activists, Puerto Rican activists, etc. And so this is, what was going on, and the overlap in the hierarchy go from police intelligence, sometimes overlapping, as I said, with FBI, FBI working closely with the CIA, but the CIA basically overseeing it all, and that's the way it works. And so with Mark David Chapman, you have this situation of a Atlanta police officer giving Mark David Chapman the hollow point bullets that helped kill John Lennon. That police officer also trained Mark David Chapman in shooting, and then you have the doorman of the Dakota apartment building where John Lennon was murdered. They say the best evidence is that he contributed to the assassinations to make sure it was successful, but he was a former CIA agent himself, and he was part of the Cuba squad that did go and try to invade Cuba with the Bay of Pigs. He was Cuban, and they
I
had
didn't
this,
know he had Bay of Pigs involvement.
yeah, and so yeah, that's the best evidence of that, and that came out in a book by a heralded music critic in England who had written several you know uh, critically acclaimed music books in England. He then wrote a book about John Lennon's life and death that went into all this detail about the dormant Dakota that night. So his name's Jose Perdomo, but it's Jose San Janis, and there's another middle name and then Perdomo. So that's some of the evidence about John Lennon and his assassination. And so what I also show in my research around this is the fact that, for example, Ernest Hemingway's editor and friend A.E. Hotchner wrote helped Ernest Hemingway with his books, but then he wrote some of his own books. He did some real good oral history, such as one about an oral history book about the Rolling Stones and the whole era of the music scene around that time, the 60s and 70s, and it was called Blown Away. And in that book, he says that uh, I forget his name all of a sudden, but the MK Ultra assistant director Robert Lashbrook in 1965, in early 1965, brought over loads of LSD, money, and agents to London, and instructed the agents to get acid in as many musicians' hands as possible. So that's at the beginning of 65. A little later, a few months later in 65, John Lennon and George Harrison are with their partners having dinner with this George Harrison's dentist and his Playboy bunny girlfriend, and they're having dinner there. And at the end of the dinner, and this has been published in a number of interviews of Cynthia Lennon and George Harrison's spouse. I mean, his girlfriend at the time, Patty Boyd. I'll say the same thing about this. But basically, so they're having dinner, and then they say we got to go because we're trying to catch a friend's band who's playing for the first time in London. And they're like, no, you can't go yet. You have to try this delicious coffee we have. And they drink the coffee, and then they say, oh, you can't go now because we dosed your coffee with the LSD with that. And George Harrison said, what's LSD? Because it wasn't popular in Britain at that time, like it was already getting popular in the United States. And John Lennon was furious. He's like, you spiked our drinks with LSD. And so they basically dosed him with acid to introduce it to him for the first time. And I argue, like, why would a dentist do that? Why would a dentist, risk his reputation, risk getting sued and all that over something like this, unless he thought he had, he
He was an
basically,
informant. He had to be an
yeah,
informant. He had to be tied.
yeah, unless he was working with, the CIA's Robert Lashbrook or, British intelligence who were working with US intelligence on these projects. And so, like the Tavistock Institute, for example, was working with U.S. intelligence on these kinds of projects. But anyway, so this is the way they had their first hits of acid, and the best that evidence is that it was likely part of Robert Lashbrook's plan, and the same thing happened with Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones, and Mick Jagger and John Lennon were very anti-Vietnam War, as was Brian Jones. And so Mick Jagger he actually held out from also taking acid. He didn't take acid as of 1967. And in comes this guy who is he's got several different names. I believe his name at this time was Zimmerman. I forget his Schneiderman. His name was Schneiderman, David Schneiderman at this time. But so David Schneiderman comes out in the Daily Mail newspaper, which is the daily newspaper, like one of the most respected newspapers. That some people say it's conservative, but conservative or liberal, it's very respected for its research. But the Daily Mail came out with an article saying that David Schneiderman was found to be working for both the FBI and British MI5, which is British FBI. When in 1967 he brought loads of drugs to a party of Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones and convinced Mick Jagger to try acid for the first time. A few hours after Mick Jagger was tripping, the police came in and raided the party, let Schneiderman out with a briefcase full of drugs, but arrested Keith Richards and Mick Jagger, thus promoting the fact that Mick Jagger takes acid, when really it was just his first time. He was convinced into trying it for the first time, and so that's some of the ways they manipulate these musicians to inadvertently promote these drugs, because later people convinced John Lennon and George Harrison to try acid again when they were touring the United States, and they saw in the United States that was a big thing, acid, and like everyone's doing it, quote unquote. But it was really David Crosby and some other musicians that convinced John Lennon and George Harrison to trip again in the United States. And so, but in the US, there's also a lot of connections between some of these musicians who were doing willingly working with the CIA, because of the fact that their families came from either the military intelligence and or were part of the oligarchy in the United States. David Van Cortlandt Crosby, for example, comes from the family that Van Cortlandt Expressway in New York is named after. Van Cortlandt Park, of thousands of acres of park, are named after. His family were the Rensselaers and the Van Cortlandts, who were part of the oligarchy. They were incredibly wealthy. And his family was also military intelligence. And best evidence is that he was doing their bidding in convincing John Lennon to try acid, and George Harrison to try acid a second time. And so this is some of the ways that they promoted drugs through. They manipulated these young musicians to inadvertently promote drugs. But then the best evidence shows that the pattern is when they start sobering up again, and getting more into activism, like John Lennon, I said, was very anti-Vietnam War, they were done away with. And that's what happened with John Lennon at the end of his life. He was sobering up. They'd also convinced him to try heroin and inadvertently promote heroin for a period of time. But then he went and just spent time trying to raise his kids, sobered up a good bit, and he came out of that that kind of hibernation. Musically, he came out with 2 albums. He said he was going to lead a Teamsters protest in San Francisco, and he had already put out a press release about that. And so he's getting back into activism right when Reagan and Bush were coming into office, during the 1980 Reagan presidential win with George Bush as his vice presidential running mate. And so he threatened to oppose the policies of Reagan and Bush. And either way, the CIA had worked on getting Mark David Chapman placed. He threw drugs and hypnosis, and this Atlanta police officer training him in shooting, giving him hollow bullets, etc., with the help of Jose Perdomo, in murdering John Lennon.
When it comes to Vietnam, why do you think that Vietnam was such a prize objective? I've always heard people speculate the idea that it was because like the heroin triangle that's there, like all of that. But I mean, there's like plenty of evidence when we talk about like when we talk about like a doped up society. I mean, this is proof right here about whenever you hear that idea of like all they want is a doped up society. I mean, this is prime evidence giving them drugs to be doped up, and it was to deter from activism. I mean, Operation Midnight Climax, the whole point of that was drugging johns at random restaurants or whatever to spark up hate against the hippies that were protesting the Vietnam War. And then people associated the hippies with LSD, and they associated these people freaking out in restaurants with LSD or just drugs in general. And then they were like, okay, then it must be the hippies. We have to protest against them. And the hippies stopped protesting Vietnam. I mean, they still kind of did it, but the activism slowed down. And then we just continued to stay in Vietnam. But I mean, it's very manipulative, not just in the aspect of using drugs, but I mean, if you explain it like how I just did, people are like, all right, that sounds far-fetched. But an easy way to do it is imagine all the experiences you hear about people taking LSD. It's a great mind-bending, altering drug. They'll literally give you an experience that it's hard to put into words. Imagine someone figured that out and just goes, how about we ramp it up? And instead of using this mind-altering drug, we shatter the shit out of it. And that's where you have the CIA's influence into it. You have the idea. It makes it easier for people that haven't seen the documents or any of this type of stuff to understand it more. Because when you start talking about this to the general public, And like, I know what it is, but to the general public, they're just like, that sounds crazy. It doesn't sound like our government. It's like, yeah, because they don't want you to know. And they've been keeping these documents on lock for the longest time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, with Vietnam, obviously it was right, part of it was there right next to Laos and the other countries, as part of the Golden Triangle for heroin. It was the best area in the world. There's two best areas in the world for heroin production. That was the Golden Triangle and the Golden Crescent for heroin production because of the poppy fields grew best. Heroin, is derived from the poppy plant. First they they get opium, turn into morphine and or heroin. And the best growing places for that is this Himalayan mountain range. It goes from it's the Himalayas, but whatever, it's that mountain range. It goes from the Vietnam area down to the Afghanistan area, or up to the, yeah, I think my geography is right, or maybe up to the Afghanistan area. And so the goal, that's where the Golden Triangle and the Golden Crescent are for the best poppy fields in the world, and all along that mountain range. And so that's why India was constantly controlled by the British and the British East India Company for cultivating poppies and opium around there, which is was incredibly lucrative crop, but also was used to sedate, divide, and oppress the masses. And I I say that because that's what Attorney General Ramsey Clark told me in 1991. I talked to him right after a conference, a political conference in Baltimore, where I was living at the time. I was working as a drug and alcohol counselor at the time, and I said, "What do you think the government uses drugs for?" And he says, "Well, I think they use it to sedate and divide the masses." And he was former U.S. Attorney General of the United States during the 1960s under Johnson, I believe. And so he just became more of an activist after he got out of that position. And so I just say also oppress the masses because, well, for one thing, as we talked about, during the Vietnam War, I have in my film how Judy Woodruff narrated a documentary about the CIA and drug trafficking during the Vietnam War, and so she interviewed loads of people that were in all parts of that pipeline of getting the opium from the poppy fields in near around the Vietnam Golden Triangle area into the United States and other parts of the world, but mostly into the United States. They talk about, and she showed the CIA documents saying yes, they were trafficking heroin from the Vietnam area into the United States, and they also have just tons of people talking about their role in that and what they saw and what the guy that was flying it and all that stuff. And so I have part of that in my film, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. I also have CIA whistleblower John Stockwell, who I saw at a different, he gave a political talk in Baltimore at that around 1990, and I talked with him, and he told me all about the CIA. He was a with CIA whistleblower who told me all about his fellow CIA agents flying out of Vietnam with heroin into the United States. And so that's just the way it worked there. And now you see a duplication of that in Afghanistan, and it's no coincidence that Afghanistan war and the Vietnam War are the two longest wars in U.S. history, because that's an incredibly lucrative crop for one thing. So the oligarchs make tons of money off of that, because the best evidence is the history of the CIA is that it was populated with either the wealthiest families themselves, were in key posts of the CIA, or their lawyers. Alan Dulles was a lawyer for the Rockefellers and J.P. Morgan interests, and also for the Bushes, et cetera. And of course, George Bush Sr. was a one-time CIA director. So they made a lot of money off the opium trafficking and heroin trafficking, but they also used it to, because when you get heroin into a community, it destroys that community. Now, not just the people that take the heroin, but the families that are dealing with their loved one who's developed a heroin or opium or opiate problem with the painkillers during the painkiller epidemic. Um, and it also just destroys the community because to get the drug, you gotta steal and rob people and all, and so the crime goes up in those communities. And so I just show a lot of the evidence in my book and film also that they were directing it towards, particularly towards minority communities, but then they expanded it out into just communities in general that they wanted to target regarding destabilizing communities around the country, and besides hurting the civil rights movement when they targeted certain drugs such as acid and other drugs and speed and all into the activist communities, it hurt those activist minds and made it harder for them to do good work around anti-war activism, around anti-Vietnam War activism.
I don't the anti-war activism is one of the most difficult things to try and understand, when it comes to just why. I mean, I get it from like a government standpoint. If you say like the government obviously wanted a war in Vietnam, but they go to such extents where it's, I mean, obviously this is where it borders human ethics, with the legal rights of a human being. That's why there's a lot of people that, use their activism to talk about the covert abilities of the CIA. But there's just so much we don't know. Like, how far does it go? I mean, you wrote something about Tupac that you turned into a film. I mean, are you saying Tupac? I'm sorry, I haven't read it, but when it comes to Tupac, are you saying that the FBI got Tupac killed? Because that's a long, like, controversial topic and kind of somehow lingers into conspiracy realms.
Yeah, well, Tupac, as I said, Tupac's whole his mother was a one-time leader of the Harlem Black Panthers. His father, his biological father, was a New Jersey Black Panther. His christened godfather was Geronimo Pratt, leader of the Los Angeles Black Panthers. He was, as I said, one time leader of the New African Panthers, which were active in 8 cities. And this was in around 1988 or so, and 89. He was a leader of that group. And so an FBI whistleblower, Wes Swearingen, came out with a book, FBI Secrets, like his memoir about his work, and he said that the FBI's counterintelligence program, which were targeting the Black Panthers, even though it was closed down in 1971 when it was being investigated by the U.S. Senate, after the activists stole those FBI documents, they continued the same counterintelligence program projects under different names. He said, and he knows because he was part of the counterintelligence program at one point in Chicago. As Wes Swearingen, I believe it was Chicago. He was part of. It might have been L.A. I'm sorry about that, but he was part of the. He was police. He was part of the FBI's counterintelligence program, and he had friends who were still in it. And so he says he knows that from his friends that are still in the FBI that that project, COINTELPRO program, that program continued at least until the mid 1990s. So here's a whistleblower saying the program continued. If it's going to continue targeting Black Panthers and Black Panther leaders, and my dog wants to be part of this interview, if you don't mind. He's just going to say hi here. There he is. Well, he's down now. Anyway, he so we know that it's still going on from this whistleblower, and we know that Tupac was trying to replicate the Black Panthers with the New African Panthers. I have him saying in an interview in my film. And so, of course, they're going to target a national, leader, Black leaders trying to replicate the Black Panthers. And, this is right before Tupac became a rap star. He was 17, 18 years old when he was leading the New African Panthers. And then at 19, he got asked to travel with the Grammy nominated group Digital Underground. And he travels around the world with them and produces, wrote some songs with them that came out on one of their albums. And then, of course, he came out with his own, solo CD by 1991. So, of course, they were targeting him. They were going to target him. So it's just obvious kind of stuff. I mean, you see that in my film, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, and the evidence is all there. So, why would the CIA get involved in targeting Tupac? And that's what I suggest is also became the case. The reason is because Tupac was only pretending to be this thug, quote unquote thug, in order to, or gangster rapper or whatever, in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them. It was part of the Bloods versus Crips peace truce movement that his Black Panther extended family had engendered in Los Angeles. He got the Bloods and Crips groups in certain communities in Los Angeles to call peace truces, and instead, and this is right before the Rodney King beating that was made famous when they caught police beating Rodney King on film, and then there was L.A. riots after that when the police officers got found not guilty of their assault on Rodney King. So Tupac pretended to be this gangster type in order to appeal to those gangs and then help politicize them. And he went to gang peace truce picnics and meetings and had the gang leaders shake hands and agree to terms of peace and to do less damage to their communities and things like that. And he got a number of gangs to stop drug dealing. First in Los Angeles, that became part of this gang peace truce movement, and then throughout California, and then spread all the way to New York City, where even the Latino gangs were convinced as part of this movement by people I interviewed, such as Panama Alba, who was a former Young Lord. The Young Lords were the Latino versions of the Black Panthers, and they were trained and they followed Bobby Seale, and Huey Newton. Well, Bobby Seale especially, but Bobby Seale and Huey Newton were the founders of the National Black Panthers, Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And so when the Young Lords came up and tried to replicate the Black Panthers, they were very successful, very active in a number of cities around the country. And in New York City, Panama Alba was a high up and was a very activist young lord. And so when I was going to graduate school in New York City in the mid 1990s, I interviewed Panama Alba. I interviewed the head of the Latin Kings, King, Antonio King Tone Fernandez.
You got some connections, dude. Holy crap.
I just cold called people and went to conferences and just kept interviewing people, and it worked. I said, I'd started my own newspaper over at Columbia University grad school and got teachers to buy it around the country and activists to buy it around the country. So I was selling between 3,000 and 6,000 these activist newspapers around the country. And I was really friendly with one of my professors, Richard Cloward of Piven and Cloward fame, who wrote some great sociology books that were really great activist books. And so King Tone told me about what they're doing. It was pretty well known. It was out in other media too. A book was written about it that was published by Columbia University Press about the Latin Kings, about their transformation into an activist group, and they changed their name to the Almighty Latin King and Queen Nation. And so they were massively targeted by police intelligence and FBI for doing that, for converting to activism. And so this was all part of that black Tupac and his Black Panther families movement of getting converting gangs. And so for that was a huge threat, because when the Latin Kings, for example, just them alone, not to mention all the other black gangs and other Latino groups, when they stopped drug dealing and got more involved in activism, that was documented about the Latin Kings and the Almighty Latin King Queen Nation transformation. They were 3,000 strong in New York City. That took 3,000 or almost 3,000 drug dealers off the street. And the way that then all those drugs not being dealt as much in New York City was a huge blow to the profits of the CIA. It was a huge blow to the profits of the banks that laundered that money. And I show the documentation of that. Yes, banks launder loads. Billions of dollars of drug money. That's been documented in many mainstream articles. And United Nations experts on that issue have talked about that. We're talking about anywhere from 500 billion to $1 trillion of laundered drug money, worldwide. And the United States is the biggest launderer of drug money. So that was Tupac's biggest threat, was getting all that money, drug dealing money, off the street and away, out of that profit, out of the CIA and the oligarchs' hands. And so that was a huge thing.
Do you think that if, like, I would probably say or make the statement that I think most people probably have very low trust in the government as of today. And I think that looking for a flaw or looking to find out this information only happens when you're not dealing with a crisis on hand. And that's what you can kind of look at as it's when we talk about like profits for the CIA or wanting them to want this violence to go on, gang wars and all this stuff. It sounds crazy unless you know the aspect of then they lose funding in so many different ways. I mean, the idea of the government always pushing for more funding and an idea is because we need it because we can implement more protection and all this type of stuff. But is that protection really needed? I mean, is it not inflated in some situations? Is something else not causing that? I mean, we know that there's crime that happens, but at what scale and who's also involved in that as well, too? I mean, we talk about the government's influence and stuff. Imagine if they're the ones causing the issues. They're the ones rising people up and causing them to fight amongst each other, creating gang violence where there necessarily might not be gang violence.
Well, that's another point that that I did write a little, just a little bit about too, or a bit about in the FBI War on Tupac, Shakur, and Black Leaders and Drugs as Weapons Against Us, is that the powers that be, these wealthiest families that made themselves the heads of the CIA and U.S. intelligence, they were incredibly racist, incredibly prejudiced in general, incredibly prejudiced. That's their history. I mean, the eugenics movement, which I touch on in Drugs as Weapons Against Us. I have a few pages on it in my book. I have a mention of it in my film with maybe a few more words on it. That was the most genocidally, prejudice movement in our country, and maybe leading up to World War II, of course, with the Germany's Holocaust and all that. These same American oligarchs actually funded the machinations of the rise of Hitler and the rise of the Nazis. But that's another story, which I get much more into in Shots, Eugenics to Pandemics. Um, Nonetheless, it's that's their story, that's their history, and that's why they would want what you just described as these gangs of people of color fighting each other, and instead of trying to look at the government as oppressing them and trying to change things for the better. So yeah, that's a major aspect of things. But and so you just have to look at history very much closer, and look at books such as Edwin Black's War Against the Weak about the eugenics movement. Edwin Black was a Chicago Tribune acclaimed columnist who has his books translated into 100 different languages. He's so his books about eugenics are pretty definitive. I mean, they're considered the most definitive books on eugenics in the world.
I'm going to ask this question. It's probably going to relate more to your new film. When it comes to, I mean, in the pandemic that we just basically went through, the one thing I never saw in the news, and I think I just recently saw a CBS story on it, but they have never talked about this ever. There was over 100,000 deaths of opioids in the last year alone between 19s and 49-year-olds, and they never talk about it. And people suggest, like, I suggest it's because the media, they're sponsored by specific pharmaceutical companies and big pharma, and if you go in depth on that stuff, you don't really, they kind of like I've seen interviews with Gerald Posner talking about his new book, and he's completely 180 on the conspiracy stuff with JFK. But when he talks about like the pharmaceutical things, they'll let him go in on it. But as soon as he starts going in depth, they immediately go, well, sorry, that's all we got. And then they cut away from him and go away. And I'm just like, even the people that they have on all the time, they don't necessarily want you opening up this loophole.
Hmm. Right. No, I don't know the exact numbers, but I did hear that yes, a record number of people overdosed on opiates during the pandemic, and it's obviously partly because they wouldn't allow in person 12-step meetings. As someone who I started as an addictions counselor in 1989, and now I do psychotherapy for a living as my day job, on all form, really specializing in trauma, but all forms of different mental illness. And But I had decade or two at least of history doing addictions counseling, along with mental health counseling, and yeah, the best. I mean, the part of the recipe for recovery is peer support, and 12-step meetings are the best meetings you can find because they're everywhere. And Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous are essential for recovery. And when you lose that, because they close down all the NA and AA meetings, sure, all these addicts trying to, gain recovery and long-term recovery lost that support, and they had to try to do it by Zoom, but it's not the same thing as in person. It's not, hugging, getting hugs are part of it all, and you can't hug someone through Zoom. It's harder to get to know them as well through Zoom and Zoom telehealth meetings. And so, yeah, a lot of people lost their recovery and died. And sadly enough, the FDA were corrupted by some of the pharma companies. Johnson was one of them that was, selling opiates. Of course, and they made their vaccine too. But there was, Purdue Pharma and several other pharmaceutical companies that were involved in the opiate industry. That they made tons of profits, but they also, in allowing OxyContin and all that. But yeah, it's very sad. It's very sad that that was a byproduct of it all.
Well, for a small percentage of the population, the elite status people, I would say, they made a lot of good profit during this times where everyone else was experiencing hardship. And it makes you question, well, how deep does it go? And we mentioned a few things already, but media influence. I mean, I always knew about it, but like we mentioned, the 1095 360 form, I'm like, that's where it started. It didn't just stem with the JFK assassination. It stems all over the board. I mean, and that's a document that we have that people say, oh yeah, the media is influenced. That's a conspiracy. No, it is. We have one document from a long time ago that proves that, but we see it when we know there's issues in our town that are going on and they're reporting something completely different. I mean, I noticed that with Ukraine. They were talking trash on Ukraine before Russia went to war with them or Russia started invading them. Then they're immediately on the other side where it's just like, does anybody else like, for me, I just want transparency in it. I mean, be honest all the way through and through. I feel like people would accept that more rather than finding out the lies later.
Yeah. Yeah, so part of my projects is always a section on the media. I feel like that's essential, and that's why we do need alternative media like your own, and all the different podcasts are exposing things beyond mainstream media. Um, and so, I quote people like the Ben Bagdikian Pulitzer Prize winner for who broke the Vietnam War Pentagon Papers stuff for the Washington Post, and then became direct director of the University of California Berkeley School of Journalism. Now he wrote a book called The Media Monopoly, where he documents the way that the media is interlocked. The boards, the board of directors of the New York Times and Time Magazine and all these different media, companies are interlocked. I mean, they share boards of directors with defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, banks, etc. And that's how they help control by corporate law. They must do, not negatively affect the profit margin of the companies that they share boards of directors with. And so, of course, when a defense contracting director is also the director of a media company, that profits increase during wars. And so, yes, the media companies should not be should not report anti-war stuff. And that's part of the way it works. And the same thing with the drug companies. If they're going to make tons of money off of certain drugs and or shots, it's the media companies aren't supposed to negatively affect their profit margin by reporting the opposite. So it's really, it's by corporate law, they're doing some of the things they're doing. And that's, they can use that excuse because they really, there's other motives for some of these people, you know.
Do you think ever I guess the reliance of power, do you think it'll ever shift to like independent sources? Not like independent like this, but like independent like streaming services, for instance. Like I noticed Netflix and some like Hulu, they'll have a documentary about something that is like the government trafficking of drugs or something of that sort. But I never see that like popularized on the television. I never see it playing on a channel or anything like that, which I start wondering like, does Netflix and all these programs, are they going to be the source where they can actually get the documentaries? Like Oliver Stone's film. I found in the NSA archives documents on Oliver Stone saying platoon was an issue. Like that makes the government look bad. And I know their influence into scripts. Independence Day, for instance, they influenced that script. They wanted a military person killing the aliens at the ending, not a civilian. And then they said, if you're going to blow up the White House, you have to blow up every other national monument around the world, just so we don't look weak. Like there's just these weird things where it's like you get the small propaganda, then the extreme propaganda, where you start wondering, everything that we're watching now, are we even able to pick up the propaganda anymore? Are we able to notice between the lines? Are we losing that aspect of critical thinking? I mean, a lot of people, and I'm not trying to relate this to the pandemic, but a lot of people did stuff without any clear evidence of why you should be doing something.
Yeah. No, I agree. They do have so much influence over these movies. Oliver Stone has done some great work in opposition of the oligarchs, in terms of exposing their assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I'm glad that some of these kind of alternative sites have at least shown, some of his films. Um, he had two films. I reviewed both of them for a CIA whistleblowing magazine called Covert Action Magazine. Used to be called Covert Action Quarterly. And so in the 1990s, I wrote an expose on the FBI war that became the FBI war on Tupac Shakur and Black leaders. And then in the last 5 years or so, I've been writing a lot more articles for them. Um, but So I wrote a review of the two films. So one was a 2 hour film, and I can't remember, that was on a bigger platform. About JFK, Destiny Betrayed, I think it was called, or that was the first one. Was it had a different title actually, Through the Looking
Revisited is
Glass.
the 2 hour version of Betrays
Yeah,
the
the
4 hour.
2 hour version was the Destiny Betrayed, and the 4 hour version was Through the Looking Glass. And I believe it was, maybe it was the other way around, but
It's the other way
either
around.
way, yeah, it's the other way around. Thank you. So, so I think they did great stuff. And now, obviously, the 4 hour one was, you could say it was on a more alternative platform because it was longer, and probably was, I guess, it was very long. But it's still harder, even amongst that group, the Netflixes and the other ones. They don't put out as much of the stuff. Like my film, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, is on a lot of digital platforms, but it's been on Tubi, it's been on Amazon Prime, and the competition does help me get the word out, but not Netflix. Netflix, I think, is a little more controlled, a little more sensorial, I'll say. And so even amongst the alternatives, the oligarchs try to buy up or control as many of the alternatives to stop things from getting out there. And that's what we're facing. That's what we're dealing with. But thankfully, just more and more alternative channels are coming out, and and I'm getting shots. For example, is on Tubi, though it's not on other platforms now, and more platforms are going to open up with shots in September. And so, yeah, it's helpful. I'm glad we have these alternatives to get more of our information out there.
I do recommend checking out your film. I'm actually going to order it and watch it because it sounds interesting, and you have a lot of information that I really appreciate you sharing on my show and everything. Is there a place where people can find your links, anything you want to promote, your books, your Twitter handle, if you want to say them off real quick, and I'll make sure I link them in the description.
Sure, thanks. So you can find all of my work at drugsasweapons.com, drugsasweapons.com. And there's more links to the movie websites from there, but that has most everything at drugsasweapons.com. It's also called johnpotash.com. It's got a bunch of different names that, for one website, shotsmovie.com, for example. But yes, you can find most of my work there. And so I really appreciate you having me on, Robbie, and I appreciate you talking openly about all this stuff. And I hope more people get exposed to this information and start acting on it and helping change society for the better for the 99% of us.
I just thought of one more question, but Kurt Cobain.
Okay, that's okay. Sure.
Kurt Cobain.
Yeah.
Government? No?
Yeah. And so I showed the evidence that he was targeted by U.S. intelligence, in the similar way. He was called the John Lennon of his generation, and I found a lot of just similar ways they targeted John Lennon and Kurt Cobain. And the reason is because what I found is that they psychologically profile some of these musicians to see how, if they can target them, how they can manipulate them to promote drugs. And then when they start sobering up, though, and they lose control over them, they stop. They do away with them. And so the pattern did fit Kurt Cobain, because he was brilliant super creative singer, songwriter who was also statedly anti-capitalist. I mean, he made fun of, he would only get on the cover of Rolling. He would only allow himself to be on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. He said if he was allowed to wear a T-shirt that says, corporate magazines still suck" or something like that. Um, and so he's just he even in a biography about Nirvana before Kurt Cobain died, he said he had wanted to put all kinds of anarchist essays on the cover of his think it was 30 million unit selling Nevermind album. And he wanted to put these anarchist essays would talk about how to create your own bomb and how to, oppose the government and everything else. But he said he thought he'd wait till he becomes more popular and then people might take it more seriously. So that was he was a radical activist actually at heart, and he did support some good causes with some concerts that were he didn't talk a lot about, but so here he was rising up on the charts with this incredible album, Nevermind. And all of a sudden, into his life comes this woman, Courtney Love. And so they date a few times, and she quickly becomes pregnant with his kid. He does the right thing and says, "Okay, well, I'll marry you, but only with a prenuptial agreement." And people around them in oral histories about Seattle and friends of of Kurt said that she basically he had this massive stomach problem which he couldn't find a cure for, and he was his diaries talk about it. He talks about in interviews, and but that heroin was he tried heroin a few times, but didn't get into it. But all his people, people around him said that she got him into using heroin regularly for the first time in his life, and it did cure his stomach problem for a bit. But then finally, a year before his death, he found a medical cure for his stomach problem, and he said in interviews, and I have those interviews in my film, where he just felt, "Oh, finally, this is great. I'm finally over this stomach problem." And so when a month before his death, he was in a Rome hospital, and his blood came back as having no illicit drugs in his system whatsoever. Okay. He was in that hospital because at that time, you have his lawyer saying that he was looking for a divorce lawyer. He was cutting Courtney Love out of his will. He was divorcing her. They were estranged, but he wanted to see his daughter. So when he was doing his tour in Rome and throughout Europe, he had Courtney Love bring over their daughter to see his daughter. And she was on a prescription of Rohypnol, which are roofies. And she, apparently had put these roofies in his drink so that when he had a drink, he almost died. He went into a coma. And so it was her prescription. The doctor said he wasn't suicide. He didn't appear suicidal. He just, it was this apparently accidental overdose of these roofies. She pretends like it was a suicide attempt. The best evidence is that she did that to him, because everyone knows that you lose memory of everything that happens when you take roofies, and that's why they use those roofies to, sadly, drug, creepy guys use it to drug women, apparently. And they're illegal in the United States. But they're legal. They're illegal in the United States and legal in Britain, where Courtney Love got them. They're legal in Britain as sleeping pills. So and so when everyone, us people in the addictions field know that in order to be a heroin addict, to have a heroin problem, you have to be using every day, or else you go into massive withdrawal symptoms. And he had and heroin stays in your system about 3 to 5 days at least, opiates, and stay in your system that long. And he had no illicit substances whatsoever in his bloodstream, when he should have had, if he was really had a heroin problem that time, a month before his death. He should have had something like that in the system. And so he said in interviews that I've sobered up. I'm done with heroin. I haven't used for a long time now. And so the blood tests support that. And so the best evidence is that is that Courtney Love aided U.S. intelligence in doing away with Kurt Cobain, because while Kurt Cobain did have that heroin problem, heroin use went up dramatically every year. Okay, five or like a major percentage. He influenced the American population into using more heroin each year. Of his stardom, 1991, 92, 93. Um, they went up and it continued going up in the 1990s. They had to do away with him because he threatened to promote abstinence and to promote sobriety. And that's the same, as it was with John Lennon and Tupac and Jimi Hendrix, sadly enough. And because they wanted to use these musicians to promote the drug use, but then when they sobered up and threatened to promote left wing activism, anti-war, anti-racist activism, they were done away with so that they wouldn't influence people in that way. And so here, with Courtney Love, you've got this situation of I interviewed her biological father, Hank Harrison, and he said that when Courtney Love, he was estranged from his own daughter. His daughter, he married. I mean, he was dating this woman, Courtney Love's mother, and they had this kid together. And but she was his mother. Courtney Love's mother was somewhat bizarre, and so he didn't want to keep going out with her, but he wanted to raise their kid, separately. And her super wealthy parents, the Reese's, Jack Reese was her dad, had abused Courtney Love's mother, according to an autobiography of that woman. She said her dad had sexually abused her growing up. And so he was super wealthy. He had investments in Bausch and Lomb and uranium mines, etc. And they paid off Hank Harrison's lawyer to lose custody completely of Courtney Love. So this is when she was about 4 or 5 years old. And so she ends up going through all kinds of stuff and ends up sending him a letter when she's maybe 13 years old and stuck in a juvenile delinquent facility, saying, they've been abusing me for years. My counselors and psychiatrists that she was seeing since she was about 3 or 4 years old, by different accounts, anywhere from 2 to 4 years old, she started seeing counselors and psychiatrists for some reason, which is incredibly, young age to see them. She said they were all having sex with me and giving me all kinds of, exotic drugs, and these drugs were MK Ultra drugs that were used on hypnosis. They were psychohypnotic drugs, Tuinals and things like that. And she names these exotic drugs at 13 years old in this letter to her dad. So her dad gets her out of this juvenile delinquent facility, and he didn't realize that that she had turned into somewhat of a monster at such an early age, because she already had a serious drug problem. She was started prostituting herself by her mid-teen years, he says, and he found heroin syringes around his house when she stayed over, when she was living with him, at different times. And so he had a hard time dealing with her, and his new wife said she's got we can't keep we can't keep having heroin needles around our house. And so anyway, he had to go to Ireland for research on a book. He was a writer, and he's in Ireland, and she visits him in Dublin when she's about 17 years old. And a guy had befriended him while he was in Ireland and Dublin and at different parts of Ireland, a guy named Stephen O'Leary. And Stephen O'Leary proceeds to, according to Hank Harrison, hang out with Courtney Love, 17-year-old Courtney Love. O'Leary's maybe in his mid to late 20s or so. And then proceeds to take her over to Britain, to England, first to London, then to Liverpool scene, where there's a bunch of rising musicians. She had on her, according to different biographies, over 1,000 hits of acid. Okay, at 17 years old, she proceeds to distribute it to these musicians in the Liverpool scene, distributes it like candy to all these musicians, and that duplicates the actions of Robert Lashbrook. I told you, the assistant director of MK Ultra from 1965, that duplicates what he was doing. And these are a bunch of rising musicians, Adam Mann, Echo and the Bunnymen, the Pogues were playing around there at the time. and she disrupts a lot of these bands. Both, it disrupts their mind with the acid, disrupts them with sleeping with a bunch of them, and she just, yeah, is and meanwhile this guy Stephen O'Leary ends up years later in around 2000, mid 2000s, 2005 or 6 or 7 or so, writes a letter to Hank Harrison saying that, I'm dying of cancer right now and I'm back in my Minnesota, home, but I just wanted to tell you that, that it was nice hanging out with your daughter, for that time in the 1980s, but I actually was kind of working for the U.S. government at that time, and I wasn't, a CIA agent per se, but I was reporting back to the U.S. Embassy every week with letters and or making in-person reports for the government, and so he basically admitted what he was doing at that time, and he was doing it with his brother Kevin O'Leary. Hank Harrison said. Now, so here's Kevin and Steve O'Leary working. He says, and Hank Harrison said they were both still working for the government, and they also took Courtney Love to some place called Ockenden Ventures, which was a refugee camp for war refugees from the Vietnam War and then the later wars, Iraq War and all. And which is very interesting because Mark David Chapman was taken to Fort Chaffee refugee camp, where former Vietnam, refugees from the Vietnam War were taken in the late 1970s. So there's some bizarre, parallels with
Coincidences.
coincidences, yeah, with Cobain's murder and John Lennon's murder. And so then, and we also see that. So I found the obituary for Stephen O'Leary. Talks about how he just like he's in Minnesota, he died in Minnesota the way Hank Harrison said in 2007, the way Hank Harrison told me, the way he published in his book that he was putting out as a PDF book. I have the book, the original book. When they finally put it out in regular print version, in hard copy version, they left out the CIA stuff. They left out the appendix with the letter from the CIA, operative Stephen O'Leary and all that stuff, and that's a shame. But nonetheless, I have the original version. I show it in my film, and so here is Kevin O'Leary and Steve O'Leary, and the question is, and so I also have Hank Harrison being interviewed by a friend, guy who had interviewed me a few times, and that guy asked me to come on and ask Hank Harrison a few more questions that interview. And Hank Harrison says some of the stuff that he had said to me on phone. He said it in this interview, and I have that in my film too, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. And so, this is some of the documentation that, yes, Courtney Love appeared to be handled by CIA agents. Apparently, her entire adult life, it appears, because when you look at, I don't know if it's the same Kevin O'Leary for sure, but there's footage of her out with Kevin O'Leary, who's much older than her, and people are asking, like, what are you guys actually a couple, even though there's like a 20, a 10 or 15, 20-year difference in age or whatever it is. But they can be seen hanging out. And so there was a guy named Ellen Hoke who said that Courtney Love offered him 50 grand, $50,000 to blow Kurt Cobain's head off. And he says this on film. Eldon Hoke says this on film, and he passed a polygraph test with the top polygrapher, when a national news program, investigating this, the Inside Edition might have been or something like that. I forget which program it was. But so when he said on film for Nick Broomfield, several days after he said that on film, he ended up dead. And he had said on film also, but I do know who took that 50. I was going to take that $50,000 because he's an alcoholic and he needed the money. But he said, but I didn't get a chance. But I do know who took that 50,000. And he started mentioning the name, and a guy was named Alan Wrench. And he said Alan, and he cut himself off. And he said, well, let the FBI catch him, not knowing what the FBI was really doing. But and he ends up dead several days later, and the last person seen with him was Alan Wrench. So that's some of the evidence that, yes, Courtney Love was knowingly or unknowingly being handled and helped with the aided in whatever happened with basically the murder of her husband, Kurt Cobain.
Thank God I asked that question. Um, dude, yeah, that would have bugged me if I would have just skipped out on Kurt Cobain. Yeah, because that's one of the, at least for my generation, that's probably one of the biggest influences. Everyone wears a Nirvana t-shirt, even though some people don't know what it means, but whatever. Um, I'll make sure I link all your links in the description, John. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.